All right, we're going to move to Milton's A Masque performed at Ludlow Castle. In your books it will be called Comus, A Masque, but that is the, actually it does just say A Masque, good for the editor. It tends to be called Comus, A Masque because it became named that in the 18th century when it was a wildly popular performance. It was performed for 70 years, in fact. And it was put to music and performed by the musician Thomas Arne in 1738, as I say, for 70 years. And for that reason, it's popularly called Comus. But for Milton, it was simply A Masque presented at Ludlow Castle, 1634. And I want to begin discussing this because this is unusual. I don't want to say it's a poem, and it's an unusual piece by Milton. I had mentioned to you that Milton wanted to master every literary form in order to prepare himself for the great undertaking of his life, which was the epic that he planned on writing from early days. And the Masque, A Masque was one of those forms. It was a very popular form in his day. And Milton wanted to engage with it as somebody who wanted to show himself not only a master of literary form, but in some ways a rival to Shakespeare as a playwright, which he says in his little dedication on Shakespeare in the 8th line. He speaks of that desire. Now, we don't know Milton as a playwright, and he doesn't write plays in general, and A Masque is a very odd form of a play. But he writes it at the age of 25 in 1634, 5 years after the Nativity Ode that we spoke of last time. 4 years after. So he was 21 when he wrote the Nativity Ode. It was performed on the estate of John Egerton at Ludlow Castle in honor of the Earl's new post as Lord President of Wales. I'll talk something about the context in a minute, but let me just talk about what a masque is, because I don't think we offer a course here in Jacobean drama. In fact, I know we don't. And masques are really a feature of Jacobean drama and Carolingian drama, for that matter. So it's a Renaissance form, and it is brought to perfection in England. Say I. Say others as well. But it didn't originate there. It's arisen throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. And we can still find it in England in various forms through mummings, through the silent plays, such as we see in Hamlet, the dumb shows, and in the sort of disguising, which we see as a common feature in Shakespeare's plays, mistaken identity, people disguised as other people and being mistook as such. They tend to be put on festive occasions, not only in the courts, as will be the case here, or in the castle, but also in halls, and even on the streets. They probably arose out in Italy, and they began, such as the Carnival is, if you ever go to Venice at the time of Carnival, with everyone's wearing a mask. And these are so ornately costume figures, and they represent mythological or even allegorical figures. There's song, there's dance, there's the complimenting of the hosts. They call upon others to join them. It's a big celebration. So that is what a masque is. And it's sort of historical legacy. It's a celebratory type of theater. But in England, it was taken over in 1513, and the drama starts to become more significant, not just the theatrical and allegorical, but there are dramatic aspects. And Ben Jonson, one of Shakespeare's great contemporaries, and that's Jonson without an H, Jonson, was credited with inventing the anti-masque, which is a brief entertainment preceding the main event and offering the other side of the coin. Because in general, in a masque, the royals that are presented as the good guys, and they solve the problem of vice. It takes the aristocrats to come in representing the virtues as they do to save the day. Jonson introduces and comically represents the unruly or sinful forces that the monarchy subdues. Now Milton, when he writes this, now I have to say, and I'll take this here, and I'll take it from a contemporary critic on this, because you've probably heard about Milton's misogyny, alleged misogyny, which I dispute and always have disputed, in part because of this play, but also because I think of the portrait of Eve in Paradise Lost and female figures in general, certainly within his day. But this play, perhaps better than any other work of Milton's, is almost a demonstration of Milton as a sort of a feminist in his age. One of the features of masques, and as I say, that's a wildly popular literary form of the day, is that they're in dialogue with one another. So the writers of masques go to other masques, watch them, and then they playfully engage with them. So it's difficult for us to pick up one of them without that context, and we're not really seeing the nod in that direction or the echoing of language and so forth. I mean, it would take us probably, I guess, a course in looking at different masques to see how they're interrelating to one another. We're not going to do that. That's not our purpose here. But suffice it to say that that is a feature of it. You just have to take my word for it, unless you want to look further yourself. And Milton, when he writes this, there are other contextual elements which I think you'll find interesting. As I say, in general, there are aristocratic figures that are represented as defeating the debauched figures. In Milton's day, and he writes this at 25 while Charles I is still king, and his wife Henrietta, the queen consort, is a Catholic, wildly unpopular in England because of that fact, but she is nonetheless, and is very interested in the theater, and even acts in plays herself. Now, when you may say, so what? The so what is that at the same time as this is being written, not only a year or two before this, a fellow by the name of, and let me just draw the name here, William Prynne. William was a prolific author. Wrote about 120 different pieces. Wrote a work called Histriomastics. I think it's 1632. My notes here. Yes. And in it, he was taken to be making a not very thinly disguised attack on the queen herself, because the whole of the play was condemning women's involvement in the theater and the way in which they represented debauchery, etc. And it was very common amongst the Puritans to wish to close theaters precisely because of their debauchery. And Prynne argued that women's involvement in the theater was particularly iniquitous, demonstrated it in various ways. And this was taken as a veiled attack on the queen herself, who had acted in plays and represented Catholicism and all of its, from Protestants' eyes, pagan practices. So Prynne and other Puritans, remember Milton is a Puritan, are more severe on these things. They want to banish all sorts of ornamentation and celebrations of sorts. So Christmas they want to do away with because of its excessive ornamentation, etc. Characteristic of the Puritans of the day. They want a pure religion. They believe that God does not delight in shows, outward shows, but wants the heart to be pure. And so his religion is not going to be a showiness or debauchery, which they also see in Roman Catholic circles, in their view. And I think it's impossible, as I say, to see the Masque, Milton's Masque, without understanding this sort of response back and forth of costumes and sets and even language interrelating to one another. But the role of women in the 1630s, remember this is written in 1634, in the 1630s, the hot topic is the role of women in theater. And it's connected in particular with the Queen, who has acted in a masque. And she, being Catholic, is associating it with all the wrong things politically for Mr. Milton, and religiously for Mr. Milton, being a Puritan himself, and very devout. Milton didn't write this particular masque for the Queen or for the court, but on the other hand, he seized the ideas of these, and in my view, and I think, and it's Anne Baines, I don't even know how you spell her name, or spell, I know how to spell, I don't know how to pronounce it. Quaro? No idea. Anne Baines Quaro argues, and I agree with her, Milton's masque is not meant as a repudiation of the masque. It is a purification, an extension of it, just like he does with Paradise Lost. It's not a repudiation of the epic per se, it's finding what the purpose of the epic was as it was originally conceived and baptizing it, as it were, and making it truly a Christian, in this case, play. In the case of Paradise Lost, an epic. And the main protagonist in it is a woman, the lady. And not only is the main protagonist, in terms of the language of the play, a lady, it is cast by a young woman. Milton himself casts a young woman as the main player, which is itself extraordinarily controversial. By the way, Prynne, for his perceived attack on the Queen, was put in, not in stocks, he was placed in those, what do you call those things? I can't remember. Where your head's sticking out, your arms are sticking through the wooden thing. I can't remember what it's called. He was pilloried, that's what it is, it's pilloried. When you're pilloried, you're in public display, it's sort of uncomfortable because you're leaning forward, whatever, and people are pelting you with things as they go by. Rotten fruit, animal dung, whatever they want. People die when they're being pilloried. So that's the form that often takes in England. In other countries, it's just a big pillory, and your hands are up and you're defenseless, and people are whipping you as they go by. And so it's a public humiliation. So William Prynne was pilloried for this, and his ears were cropped, as in they took off his ears. Now, part of it, when he did a little bit more later on, they took off the rest of his ears. And they did it for blasphemy, seditious blasphemy. Seditious in the sense that it sought to undermine the reigning king and queen. That's what he was accused of. Now, this is a fellow Puritan for Milton. Milton is not supporting the royalist cause here. As you'll know, he's going to eventually fight on behalf of he's not going to fight, but he's going to be on the Republican side of things in the Great Civil War that will ensue 15 odd years later than this. But he is clearly trying to state something rather different, and it's not support for King Charles or the Queen. It is nonetheless a representation of the female character as being able to withstand temptation, which is an extraordinary thing. Through her purity, above all, because it's a play about chastity, but also even through her intellect, but above all through her moral purity. Clearly the hero in the play. There are only 4 figures in it. There's 2 brothers, a sister. I should say there's 5, I guess. There's Comus, who's a debauched character. I'll talk about him in a minute. And then later on, we get another figure appearing to assist the lady. I'll talk about that as well. But the main figure, it sort of, and I think this is the closest allusion I can think of, there's a bit of Eve and Satan in Paradise Lost, except Eve falls to temptation. It's more like Christ being tempted by the serpent in the wilderness in Paradise Regained. So the lady is, in that sense, a Christ figure. Only in that sense. She's able to resist temptation through her virtue. Now, she doesn't represent a royal figure. It's quite plain from Milton's text that she represents ordinary virtue, not aristocratic ones. She represents an understanding, a right relation of a person to God. But she is most decidedly a female, even played by a female, which is itself intensely controversial in their day. And in the 1630s, that is the hot topic. The metaphorical, the literal and the metaphorical role of women. So Milton takes the court's chaste, heroic, feminine ideal and develops into his own vision of heroic Protestant chastity. So he makes it a Protestant understanding rather than the Catholic and aristocratic form. So it is a sort of, it's a disagreement with everyone, as is often the case with Mr. Milton. He's not with the royalists who see virtue posited in the aristocrats only and whatever, right? And the aristocrats come and save the day against the debauchery of the ordinary people, sort of hierarchical view. He's also not going to buy in the idea that women are incapable or inherently or invariably going to bring about corruption on the stage and therefore ought not to be on the stage at all. Milton not only makes the lady his central figure, he casts a woman in the role, which is in the day unusual. Shakespeare's players are male. In doing that, Mr. Milton is actually overthrowing a long tradition. In Greek theater, the actors are also male. They're wearing masks, right? So there's a long-standing tradition of male actors, not female actors, and this concern about this. But Milton puts a woman on stage. I think is very interesting. It is whatever you want to make of his portrait of women in Paradise Lost. We will come to that when we come to it. This seems like a pretty powerful argument to have to contend with about a alleged misogyny, to me. Precisely because it stands out so strongly. And at the same time, it's not really about women per se. It's more about virtue and vice in everyone. And the everyone includes women. And we will make that abundantly clear by casting a woman. So there's no ambiguity. We're not going to say everyone and then every time cast a man and say, oh yeah, the man represents women as well. No, here it is the lady. So that in itself, I think, is very, very interesting. If for that reason alone, the play is worth looking at, but I think there's more to it than that and worth looking at than that. The closest example that Milton has been cited to have used here is a particular Jacobean masque, Pleasure Reconciled to Virtue, in 1618. And that's because Ben Jonson used this anti-masque figure Comus is a jolly drunkard who appears. And he's more or less that. He's like that in Milton's play as well. He's a sort of a fusion of Bacchus, the wine god, and Circe, who, if you think back to the Odyssey, who turns men into swine. So it's not just drunkenness, it's debauchery, it's moral corruption. It makes men into not just animals, but it corrupts their moral being. That combination, and it's connected with wine, which we'll see throughout the Masque. There's a reference to wine, and it's almost magical, corrosive influence. It's symbolic in itself. I'm not sure whether Milton drank or not. I should know that, but I don't. I can easily look it up, but I can't think of it there. But in Milton's version, unlike Johnson's, the magic resides not in a father and his heir, but in the daughter of the house. As I say, extraordinary breach with tradition of the masques. Even if the masque is an evolving genre, to make the daughter the hero of the whole masque rather than the father and his heir is rather extraordinary. Now, by convention, the girl ought to be a silent allegorical ideal. She represents virtue, if you will. But in Milton's dramatic reality, she's an imaginative, adventurous woman who withstands temptation, the temptation of this seductive figure, and she does it on her own. Her brothers have gone off to find food, and they've left her defenseless. And she's strapped to a chair, can't escape, and just resists the temptation. Through the inner light within her. So I'm going to read you some interesting lines on that, which I think are evocative in light of what we will come to see in Paradise Lost. And to some degree, they make me think that the idea that Milton presents in Paradise Lost about the paradise within, happier far, is not one that he just presented at the end of his life, after he had served in Cromwell's government and was defeated, and, we're not going to have paradise on earth. The post-millennial, God's bringing about his kingdom, and the kingdom will never end. There's an inner paradise, which Milton has been consistent in portraying before his involvement in Cromwell's government and after it. But I'll read these lines. It's line 381 to 385. The words are not... They're from one of the brothers, the elder brother, and the elder brother says this: "He that has light within his own clear breast may sit in the center and enjoy bright day. But that he that hides a dark soul and foul thoughts benighted walks under the midday sun, himself is his own dungeon." Now, if you think about those words and then reflect on the idea of an inner paradise and an inner hell, Milton talks about this repeatedly in Paradise Lost. Satan, the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. What matter where I be, so long as I am still myself, etc. And then in Book 4 of Paradise Lost, in the midst of looking upon Eve, we're told that although he is in paradise, he cannot escape hell, because the hell is within him, and not one bit can he flee from it. Because your spiritual relation to God is the most important aspect of your identity, and it doesn't matter where you are. It's not a physical location. So Satan boasts that the mind is its own place, and God can't control him in that place. The play, or rather the epic Paradise Lost, demonstrates the exact contrary. No matter where he goes, he's still in hell. And in fact, when he's not physically in hell, the torment is that much greater, because he notices how hellish it is to be him in the midst of something that's pleasurable, and there's no pleasure in it for him. So the torment increases when he's not in that geographical location of hell. So he that has light within his own clear breast, that is a clear conscience, a pure heart, may sit in the center and enjoy bright day. But he that hides a dark soul and foul thoughts, benighted walks under the midday sun, himself is his own dungeon. An exact portrait of what he will expand upon in Paradise Lost, in the person, or in the figure of Satan, and in the figure of Adam and Eve as well, and at the conclusion of the whole of the epic. And consistent with what he will also say in Paradise Regained about the need for, since God has placed his Spirit in us, we ought already to be content with all things, in all situations, at all times, even in the midst of temptation. So a strong belief in the power of the person and the work of the Holy Spirit. Milton's theology has always been held suspicious. His orthodoxy on the matter of the Trinity. And I think that this is a warranted criticism. Oh gosh, it's just like, it's almost invariable. Like, I don't get phone calls, but if I'm in a class, I get a phone call. I don't know what it is. And it's actually on silent, so I don't know how that works either. Never mind. So the lady has a light within that stays with her in the midst of the darkest temptations. As I say, it's a theme recurrent in Milton's work. Well, we looked last time at the Ode on the Morning of Christ's Nativity and the importance of light, and as a metaphor of moral purity, but also of a clear conscience, and also of the capacity to stand and withstand temptation. Light with a power and an essence and a goodness that dispels darkness on its own. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And this lady, this young woman in a Masque, is a light in a dark place. So if you want to go on to Lord of the Rings, you talk about this in relation to that. Same sort of thematic use of light and darkness. There it's the light of Elendil, Galadriel's glass, right? But same significance, not so pointedly put as here. Here it's clearly connected to moral character. It is in Tolkien as well, but it's a thing there. Milton's not going to have that. It's not a thing. You don't have to hold up a glass. Your heart has to be right. So that's the thing that I find extraordinary about it, and to my mind is something that anyone who wants to accuse Milton of misogyny must contend with, which is that he seems to speak almost solely against a tendency of portraying women as figures of debauchery in theater, and therefore to be avoided, not to be cast, even. So there's a sort of a reformation zeal here in elevating women as co-equals of God's salvation and capable of withstanding on their own even, not just by their husband's side. Eve needs her husband's side. They get separated. Fall comes about. This is Milton departing from the text. We have to question why he does that. Many have. But here we have a woman standing on her own and withstanding the temptation, which is a statement. So, the men in the character, another way of looking at this, and this is also interesting, as I say, masks tend to be allegorical in their depictions. They're very caricatures, picturesque, a bit like a recitative in the opera that's not yet come about as a musical form yet, but a spoken aspect, because this is put to music, by the way, and in fact one of the musicians was one of the actors in it. The men are associated with action, and the woman here, the lady, is associated with reason and thought, which is interesting in the light of the long tradition in Western thought of two lives worth living, the vita activa, or the bios politikos, to use the Greek term, and the vita contemplativa, or the bios theoretikos, to use the Greek term. I'll write it down. So the vita activa on the one hand, and the vita contemplativa. Let me just stick with the Latin here. This will be the life of the politician, the man of action. Action being seen as a political endeavor chiefly, when men act together for a purpose. And the vita contemplativa would be represented by, and it's articulated first by Aristotle, the life of the philosopher, who devotes his life to the life of the mind. Now in the church, when the classical world is subsumed and Christianized, these two lives get subsumed as well, and the life of the philosopher gets subsumed under the life of the theologian. So the contemplative life is the one who contemplates God in his goodness. So theology tends to replace philosophy, although philosophy and theologies work hand in glove here. But the vita activa largely remains as it is. So those two types of life, both associated with men. But here, Milton casts the lady as the representation of the vita contemplativa, which is a pretty high, I mean, it's a pretty big statement. Again, I think his aim is higher than simply to elevate women and their status and their abilities. I think it's higher than that. It's a statement about, again, about the image of God in every person, without distinction. But it is a direct response to William Prynne, who states that women are the source of corruption. And on the other hand, again, the aristocrats who say, well, it's only the aristocrats themselves and the queen that can represent that sort of virtue, not the commoners. Again, the Catholic as opposed to the laity, or the clergy as opposed to the laity, or the king as opposed to the commoner. Milton's not having that. It is a common capacity. Whatever you might make of the play, it's an extraordinary sociological statement. And I don't care anything about sociology, as you know. Zero. As little as I can in one sense. But these two lives. And what even more interesting on this front, in terms of tradition, so European culture was Christianized. We know that Christianity came and was adopted into European culture. But when it did so, there was a strange sort of bifurcation, such that if you had multiple children, your firstborn son would go into politics, because that was going to be your heir. Your heir would go into politics. He would pass on the family name, he would pass on the family title, he would pass on the family fortune, and that would stay in your family then. And so the firstborn was destined for a life. He would probably do legal training and end up serving in the court in some fashion, whether he was the king or simply a courtier or an ambassador or whatever, or a military man, whatever you will. That's what the firstborn son would do. And the secondborn son could go into the church. So the aristocracy would send their first to the ways of the world and the secondborn to the church, which is why when Martin Luther, who was the firstborn of his son, decided that he was going to become a monk, his dad went ballistic. because he was doing legal training. He's the firstborn son. He's going to inherit his father's title, whatever, however small it was, and his fortune. And now the church is going to get it all. His dad's furious. Even worse, he's not going to have any heirs because he's vow of celibacy. Now eventually he decides that we're going to disband that, and he ends up with a wife and children and so forth. But that would not have been the case when he first became a Catholic priest or entered the monastery to become a theologian. So there's a whole subversion of the order of things that I think the Reformation itself is already working through, and Milton as a Puritan is further working through. Comments or questions at this point? I know it has been said for many years here that Milton was a misogynist, so I wanted to speak to the contrary. I don't think so. There's always a case to be made. There's also a counter case. The case sounds good until someone speaks against it, so somebody could speak against that. Unfortunately, I'm the only one speaking here. But this is a strong case, I think, to suggest something contrary. The myth about Milton's misogyny arises from popular renditions of how he related to his daughters and so forth, among other things. And also that he promoted the doctrine of divorce and so forth, but which isn't really misogyny, it's more anti-Christian, I would say, than misogynistic. On the basis, by the way, of intellectual incompatibility, which most people is not the basis for a divorce. But Milton didn't find himself compatible with his first wife for whatever reason and wrote this pamphlet. Nobody took it very seriously.